The member for Maroochydore.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. At a time of severe housing shortages in the private rental market, now is the time for the Queensland Government to get cracking and remove the barriers to affordable, more timely delivery of housing. Incredibly, the Queensland Government is doing the opposite by proposing more costly red tape in the home building industry, which threatens to increase the cost of a new home up to about $8,000 per home, according to industry. Moves are also afoot to increase some infrastructure charges by up to $10,000 per lot. This will hurt families, builders and other small businesses, as well as burdening one of the most stressed housing supply markets in the nation, putting home ownership further out of reach of first home buyers. The housing shortage in the private rental market here in Queensland is a humanitarian and an economic crisis, with families, including those with jobs, competing with as many as 40 other families. I know that's the case on the Sunshine Coast and many parts of Queensland as they're trying to get a rental house. Now, social housing is important, but it's not the total picture. In fact, the majority of people who are looking for rental housing will be looking to the private rental market. And the fact that there has been such a failure in housing supply, particularly in Queensland, comes back to a lot of the barriers that we see with poor planning here in Queensland under this Labor government, as well as a lack of timely infrastructure delivery. The vacancy rates are so chronically low because of this housing supply stress that we're seeing people who would never have expected to think they could be homeless facing homelessness. The REIQ says that housing rental vacancy rate in Maryborough is 0.2%, Southern Downs 0.3%, Bundaberg 0.5%, Gympie 0.4%, Rockhampton 0.4%, Sunshine Coast 0.4%, Gold Coast 0.6%, and I could name other regions as well. This vacancy rate that's so chronically low is because of a housing supply shortage and a stress in the market that's been exacerbated by what we see here in Queensland with bad planning and a lack of timely infrastructure delivery. Now's the time to coordinate action, not to add additional unnecessary costs, but to bring across the multiple government agencies that all have a say in regard to how housing is delivered here in Queensland. They must get on the same page, stop adding more costs through bad planning and a laggard and inefficient infrastructure delivery. We know that under this Labor government there's been moves in the infrastructure space to also add up to 30% extra in cost to infrastructure build, supposedly by this poorly named best practice principles, which is in fact another word for union extortion. Now, I believe in unions and the right application, particularly with regard to safety standards. But this is extortion. It is actually cutting down the delivery of the infrastructure we need in Queensland at a time when we need more bang for our buck, more delivery, and yet this practice that this government's bringing about is going to see less delivered in Queensland when we need more. We also see with infrastructure here in Queensland that this government has cut $4 billion from the forwards for infrastructure spend, $4 billion over the next 4 years, a time when, once again, there needs to be timely investment in infrastructure. But I want to say a little bit more about the private rental market and these failures of this government to address this, because of all places, Victoria, I wouldn't think I'd be singing the praises of Chairman Dan, because I think they're lunatics in many ways, but they've got something right. They're actually delivering a more timely planning and infrastructure plans around release of housing lots, as I understand, in Victoria than we're seeing in Queensland. As we heard from the Leader of the Opposition this morning, well, actually yesterday, now we've ticked over into Friday. As we heard, there's been quite a stark fall-off in the release of new housing lots in Queensland, quite a stark fall-off in new housing lots in Queensland at a time when we need to see more. I mentioned before about the poor planning and lack of timely infrastructure delivery impacting upon that release of affordable new housing? Well, I will say one thing. The Deputy Premier announced that there would be these growth areas teams, and there was a project with Caboolture West to put some enabling dollars into the infrastructure there, and it was welcomed by industry. So they're doing that on one hand, and yet on the other hand, they are talking with industry through the Economic Development Queensland about increasing the infrastructure charges by up to $10,000 per lot in some of our new PDAs here in Queensland. Now, if they do that and then replicate that through other areas of Queensland, I think we have to ask the question. The left hand of this government doesn't know what the right hand's doing. At a time when we've never seen such an affordability crisis, a supply crisis in the rental housing market, and it's causing great distress. I want to also address the building industry concern about a mandatory imposition of the silver level living housing design standards across all new builds. Now, I support there being encouragement and incentives to make housing more appropriate and livable and accessible for those with mobility issues. But industry is warning that the way that this Labor government has been proposing to mandate and bring this in could actually cost the average new home $8,000 a new build. You see, it's more than just about the size of doors and having a downstairs toilet. It's also about lot configuration, yield within housing estates, what you can't do with smaller lot housing because the standard doesn't fit, and it knocks on. And it's quite a significant impact that hasn't really been taken into consideration. And once again, it's an imposition of additional costs when there should be a more targeted way, that you're able to help people who have a need with mobility issues to be able to get into housing that is fit for purpose. But to apply that which is not fit for purpose for the majority of lots and also housing is going to add up to $8,000 per house, according to industry. It's the wrong way to go when we should be seeing a move against a poorly planned red tape and costs that are going to make it even harder for those first homeowners to get into their first home, let alone the rental market more broadly, which has a lack of supply, which needs more housing to address affordability. The state government did announce a $1 billion housing investment fund, except they had no money against that over the forward estimate. So that's disappointing, because there is a place for good social housing and ensuring that the most vulnerable have housing. But I would say at the moment it's so broad, it's beyond those who are actually entitled to social housing, but there isn't any. The broader rental market's in failure, and when we look at the release of housing product interstate, we see that Queensland's got a problem and it's getting worse. And you just can't blame interstate migration. The housing supply and the fall-off in lots being released clearly is a Queensland issue, and the amount of cost that's being added per house is getting worse. It's time that there was leadership from this government to address this, rather than press releases and ignoring the real and very distressing situation impacting right throughout our state. This government got rid of the Productivity Commission. They don't like accountability. We believe accountability is in the interests of the public. It's good democracy, but it also ensures that people can see for themselves where the money is going, and also ensure that they're getting good bang for their taxpayers' dollars, because it's not our money, it's theirs. The announcement of a parliamentary budget office by the Leader of the Opposition, I believe, is part of that process where we say you should have nothing to fear. You should have nothing to fear by releasing the truth of the figures, and that's why we've announced this as an important integrity measure. There's not much time in these speeches to cover all the areas I'd like to, but I want to go to my electorate, the Maroochydore electorate and the Sunshine Coast. Now, there was supposed to be a 786 built capacity at the Sunshine Coast University Hospital by 2021. Actually, I'll correct the record. There was supposed to be operational 786 beds at the Sunshine Coast University Hospital by this year. Then the Labor government did a fudgeroo on the websites, and their printed documentation said there would be a built capacity. Well, that sounds like the Faulty Towers version of you've got a hospital with no patients. In this case, you've got hospital rooms without beds and without staff. And this is one of the reasons we're seeing some of the worst ambulance ramping rates on the Sunshine Coast, and that's been replicated in other areas because we're not actually seeing beds in these rooms that have got staff, and it is rubbery. And look, the proof. They can put their press releases out, they can laugh and joke about it, but we have been talking to the patients who've been ramped in ambulances waiting to gain access to hospitals. And a GP clinic ain't the answer in these cases. It is, in fact, having capacity in these hospitals and systems overhauled to ensure people get a bed when they need it. I want to also address some of the transport issues on the Sunshine Coast. And I was so thrilled when the federal government announced $160 million for the Mooloolah River interchange. We've been waiting for years for this business case to be finished. We still haven't seen it from the government. It went on over 3 years. They dribbled out $7.5 million or however much it was in a business case. Talk about a never-ending story. We still haven't seen it, but fortunately the federal government has tipped in half of the funding for what is a state road, the Mooloolah River interchange. When we were in government, we did acquire most of the property for that corridor. We lost government, and then we saw this government went into this never-ending business case, and unfortunately it's meant that the last 6 years that project hasn't been started. But finally it's going to start, even if this government is only tipping in $4 million this year out of $320 million bill, which is pretty pathetic, but thank goodness it's starting because it's dangerous and it needs to happen. I want to also address the issue of mass transit. We all support better public transport. There has to be better public transport. But this also has to be something where you listen to the people and get it right. And clearly, and I know my colleague, the member for Cognate, and I have been vocal on this issue because we've been listening to our community, and they don't want the higher level of density that Council were proposing to go along initially with a light rail, and now they say, oh, it's not necessary light rail between Caloundra and Maroochydore, up the Nicklin Way and through Alexandra Parade and other areas. They still are talking about taking out 2 lanes of traffic on a very busy road. Now, that's talk about having hope to have mode shift by taking out 2 lanes of traffic and yet increasing the density to a high level at the same time. You'll never get out of the congestion. That's not the way to address the transport issues. We want to see an integrated transport network that services the whole of the Sunshine Coast, and as part of that, get heavy rail into Maroochydore on the Camcos corridor. Interesting that the federal government, through Infrastructure Australia, did put money into a business case, but in the executive summary of that business case for the North Coast Connect, which included a segment of Camcos corridor for heavy rail, one of the factors they said was a delivery risk was, one, there was no proponent because the state government wasn't manning up and being the proponent, and secondly, it wasn't in the current Queensland government transport strategies. That's unfortunate, and I believe it's time this government did put that project into their transport strategies, redo the business case, get this thing going. Now's the time, and to stop fluffing around on a light rail option and increase density down the Nicklin Way, which will destroy the amenity of these communities. We want to see our communities with enhanced amenity, with the right planning, but don't waste money on projects that the community are clearly saying is not the right way to go. Policing has been a huge issue, and one that we know they've been under the pump with many demands. But hooning the complaints, I heard my colleague, the member for Surfers Paradise, expressing some of his concerns at other colleagues, and the lack of access to police and transport officers to work with them. We used to have these joint operations where you'd have the transport officers go out as well, and they would address those issues of non-compliant vehicles. I don't even know when they last ran a joint operation. It's time that these frontline staff were put in place, not only for peace and good behaviour in our community, but for safety. They're desperately needed. So, Mr Acting Speaker, we want to see this issue also addressed.